Introduction of With the Turks in Palestine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Setu. With the Turks in Palestine by Alexander Aaronsohn. Introduction. While Belgium is bleeding and hoping, while Poland suffers and dreams of liberation, while Serbia is waiting for redemption, there is a little country the soul of which is torn to pieces. A little country that is so remote that her ardent sighs cannot be heard. It is this country of perpetual sacrifice, the country that saw Abraham build the altar upon which he was ready to immolate his only son, the country that Moses saw from a distance, stretching in beauty and loveliness, a land of promise never to be attained, the country that gave the world its symbols of soul and spirit. Palestine. No war correspondents, no Red Cross or relief committees have gone to Palestine, because no actual fighting has taken place there, and yet hundreds of thousands are suffering there that worst of agonies, the agony of the spirit. Those who have devoted their lives to show the world that Palestine can be made again a country flowing with milk and honey, those who have dreamed of reviving the spirit of the prophets and the great teachers, are hanged and persecuted and exiled, their dreams shattered, their holy places profaned, their work ruined. Cut off from the world, with no bread to sustain the starving body, the heavy boot of a barbarian soldiery trampling their very soul, the dreamers of Palestine refuse to surrender. And amidst the clash of guns and swords, they are battling for the spirit with the weapons of the spirit. The time has not yet come to write the record of these battles, nor even to attempt to render justice to the sublime heroes of Palestine. This book is merely the story of some of the personal experiences of one who has done less and suffered less than thousands of his comrades. Chapter 1. 35 years ago, the impulse which has since been organized as the Zionist movement led my parents to leave their homes in Romania and emigrate to Palestine, where they joined a number of other Jewish pioneers in founding Zichron Jacob, a little village just south of Mount Carmel in that fertile coastal region close to the ancient plains of Armageddon. Here I was born. My childhood was passed here in the peace and harmony of this little agricultural community, with its whitewashed stone houses huddled together for protection against the native Arabs who at first menaced the life of the new colony. The village was far more suggestive of Switzerland than of the conventional slovenly villages of the East, mud-built and filthy. For while it was the purpose of our people in returning to the Holy Land to foster the Jewish language and the social conditions of the Old Testament as far as possible, there was nothing retrograde in this movement. No time was lost in introducing progressive methods of agriculture, and the climatological experiments of other countries were observed and made use of in developing the ample natural resources of the land. Eucalyptus, imported from Australia, soon gave the shade of its cool, healthful foliage where previously no trees had grown. In the course of time, dry farming, which some people consider a recent discovery but which in reality is as old as the Old Testament, was introduced and extended with American agricultural implements. Blooded cattle were imported, and poultry raising on a large scale was undertaken with the aid of incubators, to the disgust of the Arabs, who look upon such usurpations as the hen's functions as against nature and sinful. Our people replaced the wretched native trails with good roads bordered by hedges of thorny acacia, which in season were covered with downy little yellow blossoms that smelled sweeter than honey when the sun was on them. More important than all these, a communistic village government was established, in which both sexes enjoyed equal rights. including that of suffrage. Strange as this may seem to persons who, when they think of the matter at all, form vague conceptions of all womenfolk of Palestine as shut up in harems. A short experience with Turkish courts and Turkish justice taught our people that they would have to establish a legal system of their own. Two collaborating judges were therefore appointed, one to interpret the Mosaic law, another to tamper with the modern jurisprudence. All Jewish disputes were settled by this court. Its effectiveness may be judged by the fact that the Arabs, wary of Turkish venality, as open and shameless as anywhere in the world, began in increasing numbers to bring their difficulties to our tribunal. Jews are law-abiding people, and life in those Palestine colonies tended to bring out the fraternal qualities of our race. But it is interesting to note that in over 30 years, not one Jewish criminal case was reported from 45 villages. Zichron Jacob was a little town of 130 fires, as we call it, when in 1910, on the advice of my elder brother, who was the head of the Jewish experiment station at Athlete, an ancient town of the Crusaders, I left for America to enter the service of the United States in the Department of Agriculture. A few days after reaching this country, I took out my first naturalization papers and proceeded to Washington, where I became a part of the great government service whose beneficent activity is too little known by Americans. Here I remained until June 1913, when I returned to Palestine with the object of taking motion pictures and stereopticon views. These I intended to use in a lecturing tour for spreading Zionist propaganda in the United States. During the years of my residence in America, I was able to appreciate and judge in their right value the beauty and the inspiration of the life which my people led in the Holy Land. From the distance, too, I saw better the need for organization among our communities, and I determined to build up a fraternal union of young Jewish men all over the country. 2 months after my return from America, an event occurred which gave impetus to these projects. The physician of our village, an old man who had devoted his entire life to serving and healing the people of Palestine, without distinction of race or religion, was driving home one evening in his carriage from a neighboring settlement. With him was a young girl of 16. In a deserted place, they were set upon by 4 armed Arabs, who beat the old man to unconsciousness as he tried in vain to defend the girl from the terrible fate which awaited her. Night came on. Alarmed by the absence of the physician, we young men rode out in search of him. We finally discovered what had happened, and then and there, in the serene moonlight of that Eastern night, with tragedy close at hand, I made my comrades take oath on the honor of their sisters to organize themselves into a strong society for the defense of the life and honor of our villagers and of our people at large. These details are perhaps useful for better understanding of the disturbances that came thick and fast when in August 1914 a war madness broke out among the nations of Europe. The repercussions was at once felt even in a remote corner of the earth. Soon after the German invasion of Belgium, the Turkish army was mobilized, and all citizens of the empire between 19 and 45 years were called to the colors. As the Young Turk Constitution of 1909 provided that all Christians and Jews were equally liable to military service, our young men knew that they too would be called upon to make the common sacrifice. For the most part, they were not unwilling to sustain the Turkish government, while the constitution imposed on them the burden of militarism. It had brought with it the compensation of freedom of religion and equal rights. And we could not forget that for 600 years Turkey had held her gates wide open to the Jews who fled from Spanish Inquisition and similar ministrations of other civilized countries. Of course, we never dreamed that Turkey would do anything but remain neutral. If we had any idea of the turn things were ultimately to take, we should have given a different greeting to the Moshtar, or sheriff, who came to our village with the list of mobilizable men to be called on for service. My own position was a curious one. I had every intention of completing the process of becoming an American citizen, which I had begun by taking out first papers. In the eyes of the law, however, I was still a Turkish subject, with no claim to American protection. This was sneeringly pointed out to me by the American consul at Haifa, who happens to be a German. So there was no other course but to surrender myself to the Turkish government. End of chapter 1. Recording by Setu. Chapter 2 of With the Turks in Palestine by Alexander Aaronsohn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pressed into the service. There was no question as to my eligibility for service. I was young and strong and healthy, and even if I had not been, the physical examination of Turkish recruits is a farce. The enlisting officers have a theory of their own that no man is really unfit for the army, a theory which has been fostered by ingenious devices of the Arabs to avoid conscription. To these wild people, the protracted discipline of military training is simply a purgatory, and for weeks before the recruiting officers are due, they dose themselves with powerful herbs and physics and fast, and nurse sores into being, until they are in a really deplorable condition. Some of them go so far as to cut off a finger or two. The officers, however, have learned to see beyond these little tricks, and few Arabs succeed in wriggling through their dragnet. I have watched dozens of Arabs being brought in to the recruiting office on camels or horses, so weak were they, and welcomed into the service with a severe beating, the sick and the shammers sharing the same fate. Thus it often happens that some of the new recruits die after their first day of garrison life. Together with 20 of my comrades, I presented myself at the recruiting station at Akko, the Saint Jean d'Acre of history. We had been given to understand that once our names were registered, we should be allowed to return home to provide ourselves with money, suitable clothing, and food, as well as to bid our families goodbye. To our astonishment, however, we were marched off to the Han, or caravanserai, and located into the great courtyard with hundreds of dirty Arabs. Hour after hour passed. Darkness came, and finally we had to stretch ourselves on the ground and make the best of a bad situation. It was a night of horrors. Few of us had closed an eye when at dawn an officer appeared and ordered us out of the Han. From our total number, about 300, including 4 young men from our village and myself, were picked out and told to make ready to start at once for Safed, a town in the hills of northern Galilee near the Sea of Tiberias, where our garrison was to be located. No attention was paid to our requests that we be allowed to return to our homes for a final visit. That same morning we were on our way to Safed, a motley, disgruntled crew. It was a 4 days' march, 4 days of heat and dust and physical suffering. The September sun smote us mercilessly as we straggled along the miserable native trail full of gullies and loose stones. It would not have been so bad if we had been adequately shod or clothed, but soon we found ourselves envying the ragged Arabs as they trudged along barefoot, paying no heed to the jagged flints. Shoes to the Arabs are articles for ceremonious indoor use. When any serious walking is to be done, he takes them off, slings them over his shoulder, and trusts to the horny soles of his feet. To add to our troubles, the Turkish officers, with characteristic fatalism, had made no commissary provision for us whatever. Any food we ate had to be purchased by the roadside from our own funds, which was scant enough to start with. The Arabs were in a terrible plight. Most of them were penniless, and as the pangs of hunger set in, they began pillaging right and left from the little farms by the wayside. From modest beginnings, poultry and vegetables, they progressed to a larger game, unhindered by the officers. Houses were entered, women insulted. Time and again I saw a stray horse grazing by the roadside, seized by a crowd of grinning Arabs, who piled on the poor beast's back until he was almost crushed to earth, and rode off triumphantly, while their comrades held back the weeping owner. The result of this sort of requisitioning was that our band of recruits were followed by an increasing throng of farmers, imploring, threatening, trying by hook or by crook to win back the stolen goods. Little satisfaction did they get, although some of them went with us as far as Safed. Our garrison town is not an inviting place, nor has it an inviting reputation. Lord Kitchener himself had a good reason to remember it. As a young lieutenant of 23 in the Royal Engineering Corps, he was nearly killed there by a band of fanatical Arabs while surveying for the Palestine Exploration Fund. Kitchener had a narrow escape of it. One of his fellow officers was shot dead close by him, but he went calmly ahead and completed his maps. Splendid, large-scale affairs which have never since been equalled, and which are now in use